A maidservant took the place of her young mistress and married the deaf and lame only son of a ruined merchant guild. A few days later, the maidservant knelt before the young master and spoke. "I am not the lady of the house. I am but a maidservant." The young master slowly opened his mouth. "I knew. And I am neither deaf nor lame." Both were fakes. Both were hiding true secrets. Let us begin this tale of revenge, the story of a maidservant and a young master who feigned deafness, set in the old medieval lands. If you traveled 3 days south from the royal castle along the muddy castle road, you would reach a historic merchant guild in a medieval village. There was a time when this renowned guild crossed the shires, transporting fine wool, grain, rare tonics, and crafted pottery. But those prosperous days now felt like a distant, fading memory. After Edmund, the guild master, passed away from a sudden illness, the guild began to visibly decline. The granaries grew empty, the merchants turned their backs one by one, and all that remained was a weathered wooden sign. The old manor hall, inherited from his ancestors, and the only son of the household left alone in that vast estate. The young master's name was Arthur. Left all alone at the age of 22, he was known among the village folk as the deaf and crippled heir. He seemed entirely deaf in his left ear, offering no reply no matter how loudly one shouted, and his gait was terribly awkward, dragging his right leg as if it were a heavy log. People said the affliction came upon him after his father died. Amidst words of pity, the village gossip never ceased, with peasants whispering about the tragic fate of the household before it completely fell into ruin. At the center of those whispers were always Arthur's kin. Arthur's father had 2 younger brothers. The older uncle was Giles, and the younger uncle was Silas. Though they carried themselves as respectable men, what they truly lusted after was the wealth and the very lives of others. Even while their older brother was alive, they were the sort to secretly peer into the ledgers and forge the guildmaster's wax seal to siphon off the estate's silver coins. Once Edmund died, they became even more brazen. Believing their nephew to be deaf, lame, and entirely ignorant of the world's workings, they sought to snatch the keys to the guild's storehouses one by one. Outwardly, they shed false tears, claiming their poor nephew was pitiful and needed their care. But behind his back, they were already plotting to sell the manor hall and auction off the manor fields. Arthur knew. He knew exactly how perilous his situation was. On the night his father died, young Arthur saw it. He saw his uncles slipping out of his father's bedchamber, clutching a small leather pouch of deadly powder. They claimed his father had succumbed to a sudden sickness, but the death was far too swift and far too quiet. Arthur tried to unearth the truth, but it was difficult, and he had no proof. And he realized something crucial. If he fought this battle openly now, he would not survive. So the path he chose was to pretend his hearing was gone and his leg was ruined. Since there was still wealth left to be squeezed from the dying guild, he knew his uncles would leave him be for a time. In that narrow window, Arthur quietly gathered evidence. The traces of ledgers smuggled from his father's room, the discrepancies in the wax seals remembered by the merchants, and the things witnessed by the lone servant who had been in the manor the night before his father died. carving each piece of truth deep into his heart, Arthur bided his time. A marriage had already been arranged for Arthur long before his father's passing. Edmund had formed a pact with Agnes, an impoverished noble widow residing in the village. It was a calculated alliance. Edmund sought the prestige of nobility for his lineage, while Agnes desperately needed the guild's wealth to save her ruined estate. After Edmund's sudden death, Arthur's uncles forcefully pushed for the wedding to proceed exactly on schedule. They believed that pairing their crippled nephew with a fallen noblewoman would make the couple entirely reliant on them, allowing Giles and Silas to easily manipulate the household and swallow the remaining fortune. Agnes agonized over the matter for days. She had endured for 10 winters since losing her husband, but now her coffers were scraping the bottom. And scraping together a proper dowry to marry her daughter off to a high lord was beyond her means. Yet, sending her precious daughter, Cecily, renowned throughout the neighboring shires for her breathtaking beauty and impeccable manners, to a ruined merchant estate, felt like a death sentence. Then, a singular thought crossed her mind. She could send her maidservant to be married in her daughter's stead. In Agnes's household, there was a maidservant who had grown up alongside the family since childhood. Her name was Bess. Born in the same year as Cecily and raised side by side, she bore a striking resemblance to the young mistress. Bess was exceptionally clever and had even learned to read the letters on parchment. Her character was righteous and bold, and she was never one to panic, no matter how dire the circumstances. Agnes summoned Bess. Mixing sweet honeyed words with veiled threats, she spoke. "Bess, you must take Cecily's place and go to that merchant's estate. What could a deaf cripple possibly know? If you just endure it there for a few years until I can arrange a proper marriage for Cecily, I will grant you your freedom." Hearing those words, Bess remained silent for a long time. Freedom. To a maidservant, there was no word more precious. Yet Bess also knew it could very well be a lie. Entering a ruined household to waste years of her life and serving a deaf, crippled young master as her husband would be no easy task. Bess pondered the choice all through the night, and the next day she sought out Agnes and gave her answer. "I will go in her stead." The wedding with Arthur was held at the Stone Parish Church. By the king's and church's law, the vows required public consent at the church door before the priest. Agnes dressed Bess in a fine linen gown. Because Bess and Cecily had grown up side by side since infancy, their faces and figures were virtually identical. Furthermore, Giles and Silas, being mere merchants, had never been permitted a close audience with the noble Lady Cecily before the guild's ruin. Utilizing noble cosmetics and keeping her head bowed in practiced, demure grace, Bess perfectly masqueraded as the highborn bride. When the priest confirmed their identities at the church door, the uncles, completely fooled by her aristocratic bearing, did not suspect a thing. That night, left alone in the candle-lit bridal chamber, Bess slowly looked around the room. The furnishings were worn, but one could easily guess they once held great dignity. The faded tapestries and the neatly stacked books in the corner were covered in the marks of many hands. It was the trace of someone who read diligently. Just then, the heavy oak door opened, and Arthur entered. Bess bowed her head. Arthur dragged his leg across the floorboards and sat opposite her. A long silence flowed between the two. Bess lifted her eyes and studied her new husband's face. They called him a deaf fool, but his expression was strangely sharp and clear. His gaze, which calmly scanned the objects in the room without wavering, was not the gaze of a broken man. Bess spoke in a voice so soft it could barely be heard. "The hearth fire burns beautifully tonight." At that moment, Arthur's eyelid twitched ever so slightly. Bess did not miss it. A few days passed since that night. Bess, pretending to know nothing, began to grasp the workings of the manor's household. She learned where the keys to the granary were kept, which room housed the heavy leather ledgers, and exactly when the uncles would visit and what they would take away. True to her life as a maidservant, her hands were quick and her wits were sharp. It took her less than 3 days to figure out every hidden corner of the vast estate. One night, Bess finally sat before Arthur. In the quiet room with only the two of them, she softly opened her mouth. "My lord, I am not Cecily from the noblewoman's estate." Arthur's expression hardened. "I am her maidservant. My name is Bess. I came to this place in my young mistress's stead." A long silence followed until Arthur slowly opened his mouth. "I knew." Bess was startled. "I am not deaf either, and my leg is perfectly sound." Arthur looked straight at Bess. "The night before the wedding, I heard Tom the matchmaker whispering something to my uncles. Agnes likely found some weakness to exploit and bought their silence with silver coins. I went through with this marriage knowing from the very beginning that you were a fake. Then why did you accept me?" At his words, Bess caught her breath. Then Arthur slowly poured out the reasons why he had been playing this grand charade. His father's murder, his uncle's treacherous plot, and the disguise he chose to gather evidence. He was a man who had been fighting a long, solitary war. With no one to help him and no one to trust, he had been fighting entirely alone. As Bess listened to his tale, she fought back the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "I came to this place because Agnes promised to give me my freedom, but I never truly believed she would keep that promise. I must find my own way to survive. If you intend to take revenge on your uncles, my lord, I wish to help you. But in return, promise me one thing." "What is it?" "When the revenge is complete and this guild rises again, grant me my freedom." Arthur looked at Bess for a long time. The pale moonlight spilled into the room through the window. He slowly nodded his head. "I promise you." The strange alliance between the two began. By day, Bess kept a watchful eye over the household. The uncles sneered at her, thinking she would live a frustrated life as the wife of a deaf cripple, and their condescending eyes bred carelessness. Bess slipped right through the cracks of their arrogance. Whenever the uncles visited, she would bring them hot ale or herbal tea, listening intently to their conversations. She would pretend to dust the shelves while keeping her eyes fixed on the ledgers, memorizing exactly which passages were being scratched out and rewritten. By night, she relayed everything she had seen to Arthur. Based on her words, Arthur pieced the puzzle together, one by one. Through this process, the two slowly began to understand each other. Arthur realized that Bess was no ordinary woman. It was not that she felt no fear, but rather that she took action despite her fear. She knew how to read the parchment. Her eyes for judging a situation were razor sharp, and once she set her mind to a task, she did not waver. Bess, too, realized that Arthur was no foolish young master. He possessed the profound resilience unique to someone who had fought alone for a very long time. He spoke few words, but every single word he uttered carried immense weight. As the nights piled up, with the two of them sitting side by side, poring over the ledgers and organizing their evidence, the lines of suspicion that initially stood between them gradually began to blur. It happened one night. In the room where the oil lamp burned low, Arthur had an old ledger spread open. Pointing at the pages with his finger as he explained, Bess was leaning in close beside him, peering at the parchment. Then Arthur spoke. "This part right here. When my father was alive, this entry was clearly recorded as 300 bolts of fine wool. But now it says 150. They swapped the numbers." "How do you remember the original numbers?" Bess asked. "From a young age, I was always the one sitting beside my father, grinding his ink and double-checking the character marks," Arthur explained. "Because of that, I vividly remember his specific habits with Latin shorthand and exactly where the major accounts were positioned on the page. When I look at these altered ledgers, the forged handwriting stands out immediately. You can even see the rough, scraped patches on the parchment where they erased the old ink to write the new numbers over it." Bess looked at Arthur for a moment. She felt that he had not been gathering evidence merely for the sake of cold revenge. To him, this merchant guild was his father, his childhood, and all his lost time. Bess spoke quietly. "You love this guild very much, my lord." Arthur said nothing for a moment. Then he spoke in a low, slow voice. "This guild must survive, so I can prove exactly why my father had to die. If I cannot prove the truth," Arthur continued, his voice barely a whisper, "then my father will simply be remembered as a man who died of a sudden winter fever." At those words, Bess asked nothing more. She merely lowered her gaze back to the heavy parchment ledgers, instinctively reaching out to turn the next page for him. The two of them pored over the records until the pale light of dawn crept through the wooden shutters. From that night on, something between them shifted. It was hard to put into words, but the air in the cold stone chamber had undoubtedly grown warmer, forged by a shared, silent trust. The crucial clue emerged from a place they least expected. One afternoon, while Bess was sweeping the dusty corners of the estate's old stone storehouse, she stumbled upon a weathered wooden chest hidden beneath a pile of burlap sacks. Judging by the thick layer of dust, it had sat undisturbed for years. When she pried open the rusted iron latch, she found a bundle of faded parchment letters and a small leather-bound ledger inside. Bess unfolded the first letter. Her hands trembled as she read the ink strokes. These were the personal writings of Edmund, the former guildmaster and Arthur's late father. The pages contained undeniable proof of how Giles and Silas had forged his wax seal and altered the guild's accounts. There were records of bitter arguments after Edmund discovered their treachery. And the final letter, written in a hurried, fearful hand, bore a chilling message. "My own brothers mean to be rid of me," the parchment read. "If I am to pass from this world suddenly, know that it was not the will of God. If the one reading this is my son, Arthur, I beg of you, do not let your father's death be in vain." That night, by the dim light of the hearth fire, Bess handed the letters to Arthur with trembling hands. Arthur said absolutely nothing as he read them. Bess watched him closely from across the wooden table. When Arthur finally set the parchment down, tears welled in his eyes. It was a heavy, suffocating grief he had swallowed and hidden for years. He called out to his father into the quiet room, his voice breaking. Bess did not offer empty words of comfort. She simply sat beside him in the cold chamber, and her quiet presence was enough. Now, the two of them had proof. But in this harsh, medieval world, possessing a piece of parchment did not immediately overturn the power of wealthy men. Giles and Silas had spent years building their influence in the village, lining the pockets of the local sheriff and the manor guards. If Arthur and Bess simply marched in with a single letter, they would likely be silenced or thrown into the dungeon. The two put their heads together once more. Arthur spoke in a hushed tone. "There are still merchants in the surrounding shires who remember my father. If they can testify that my uncles used a forged signet ring to conduct business with them, the weight of our evidence will be undeniable." "How will we persuade them?" Bess asked. "I must seek them out myself," Arthur replied. "But as long as I must play the deaf and lame fool, I cannot leave the estate without drawing suspicion. We must think of another way." Bess thought for a moment before speaking. "I will go in your stead. If I tell the household that the new bride wishes to visit her mother's cottage in the neighboring village, no one will question it. Tell me where to find these men. I will persuade them." Over the course of 3 days, traveling in a modest wooden cart along muddy, rain-soaked lanes, Bess visited 3 different merchant houses. She sought out the men who had long-standing ties to the guild, showing them Edmund's letters and reminding them of the unfair deals they had been forced into. Many feared the retaliation of Giles and Silas. Some cowered at the thought of losing their livelihoods. Yet, Bess did not give up. She sat before each man, her voice steady and dignified. "I know you are afraid," she told them. "I am afraid too. But if we remain silent now, this wickedness will be buried forever. A good man's murder and a family's ruin will be swept away as if they never happened. In the eyes of God, is that just?" The first man was Hugh, a cloth merchant who supplied fine wool to the capital. Giles had secretly used Edmund's forged seal to cut Hugh's prices in half, causing him a grievous loss in silver coins. Upon hearing Bess's plea, Hugh closed his eyes for a long time. Finally, he spoke slowly. "When Master Edmund was alive, doing business with your guild was a matter of honor. I will testify." The second was John, a grain merchant from the northern shires. At first, he stubbornly refused. He had personally experienced how ruthless and vindictive Arthur's uncles could be, having seen them ruin men over a few pennies. But Bess did not back down. She looked John straight in the eye and spoke with fierce conviction. "Sir, I am but a low-born maidservant. I came into this marriage pretending to be a noblewoman just to survive." "It would be a lie to say I do not fear the hangman's noose. But I have learned that even in the face of terror, there is a righteous path one must walk." "I believe you know that path as well." John stared at Bess for a long time. At last, he He let out a heavy sigh and nodded his head. The third man was William, a veteran merchant who had traded with Edmund for nearly a decade. Before Bess could even present the letters, the old man's eyes were already red with unshed tears. "I always knew in my heart that Master Edmund did not die of a simple winter fever," William said, his voice cracking. "I will stand with you. It is the last measure of respect I can offer my old friend." In the end, all three merchants pledged to testify. It was exactly what they needed. Arthur and Bess prepared their next move with absolute precision. They decided not to take their case to the local sheriff's court, knowing the sheriff was likely bribed by the uncles. Instead, they would ride directly to the Grand Manor Hall of the Royal Inspector. The current Royal Inspector, Lord Robert, was renowned throughout the realm for his unyielding honesty and strict adherence to the king's law. Carrying the hidden letters, the altered ledgers, and the sworn backing of the merchants, Arthur and Bess arrived at the inspector's hall. For the first time in years, Arthur stood tall on both feet, his posture proud, and walked openly into the great hall, listening perfectly to the echoes of his own footsteps as he approached Lord Robert. "My lord," Arthur spoke, his voice clear and unwavering, "I am Arthur, the only son and heir to the Merchant Guild. My hearing is sharp, and my legs are sound, though I have played the part of a crippled fool for years. I am here to present the reason why." He laid everything bare before the royal inspector. He spoke of his father's murder, the treacherous plot hatched by Giles and Silas, the necessity of his humiliating disguise, and the long, dark road that led him to this court. Bess stood firmly by his side, testifying to everything she had witnessed and discovered within the estate. The testimonies of Hugh, John, and William were added to the record. Edmund's desperate final letters and the forged parchment ledgers were spread across the heavy oak table. Lord Robert reviewed the documents in grim silence. When he finished, he immediately dispatched his castle guards to drag Giles and Silas before him. Even as they were hauled into the grand hall in irons, the uncles bellowed with arrogance. They claimed Arthur was a madman, his mind rotted by illness, and that the entire accusation was a wicked lie spun by a deceitful woman. Giles, in particular, pointed a trembling, furious finger at Bess, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Whatever that wench says is a lie. She is nothing but a low-born maidservant belonging to Lady Agnes. She is a fraud who dared to dress in a linen gown to marry into our family. Will you truly trust the word of a peasant impostor, my lord?" Murmurs erupted among the scribes and guards in the hall. Bess kept her hands neatly folded before her and raised her chin. Her face was pale, but the fire in her eyes did not waver. "Yes," Bess said, her voice cutting through the whispers, "I am a maidservant. I will not hide my low birth. But being born poor does not mean I speak falsely. I am only swearing to what I have seen, heard, and touched with my own hands. Whether my words are true or false will be proven not by my blood, but by these ledgers and the wax seals upon these letters." Lord Robert leaned forward, his voice a low, dangerous rumble as he addressed Giles. "And what do you say to the claim that the signet ring used on these accounts was forged?" Giles opened his mouth, but the words died in his throat. Silas desperately tugged at his older brother's sleeve, but the trap had already sprung. Hugh, John, and William stepped forward one by one, detailing every instance where the forged seal and falsified numbers had robbed them of their silver. Hugh, the veteran cloth merchant, unrolled his own pristine trade records and laid them beside the guild's corrupted ledgers. There were 3 distinct entries where the shillings and pounds did not match, plain for all to see. But it was when Edmund's final letter was read aloud that the great hall fell into a deathly silence. As the scribe read the trembling words of a father anticipating his own murder, Arthur stood with his eyes closed, bearing the weight of his grief. Bess stood steadfast beside him, anchoring him through the heavy, sorrowful quiet. The judgment was swift and absolute. Giles and Silas were found guilty of theft, forgery, and the murder of their own blood. They were sentenced to the harshest punishment under the king's law. Every stolen pound and silver coin, every acre of land, and the rightful mastery of the merchant guild were stripped from them and restored to Arthur. Stepping out of the gloomy manor hall into the courtyard, Bess looked up at the sky. The pale winter sun felt surprisingly warm on her face. Arthur stepped up beside her. "Thank you," he said softly. Bess shook her head. "I was only fighting for my own survival, my lord." "Even so, I thank you," Arthur replied. "Had it not been for you, I would still be sitting in the dark, entirely alone." A comfortable silence settled between them. Finally, Bess spoke. "You made a promise. You said you would give me my freedom." "I remember," Arthur said, turning to look at her. "But I must ask you one thing. Once you have your freedom, where will you go?" Bess had no answer. In truth, she did not know. She had spent her whole life dreaming of escaping her servitude, but she had never dared to imagine what a free life would actually look like. Where would she sleep? How would she buy her daily bread? Arthur spoke gently. "If you have nowhere else to go, would you stay and help me run the guild? You can read the ledgers. You know how to speak to merchants, and you do not break when the world turns against you. A woman like you would be the greatest treasure this guild could possess. Not as a maidservant, of course." Bess looked up at him, her brow furrowed. If not as a maidservant, then as what? Arthur hesitated for a moment, a faint flush rising to his cheeks. "As my wife? If you would consent to marry me, truly marry me, before the parish priest." A laugh escaped Bess's lips. It was a bright, airy sound, lighter than any laugh she had ever known in her hard life. In the months that followed, the merchant guild slowly breathed back to life. Arthur rode out to the shires himself, shaking hands and restoring the broken trust of the tradesmen. Bess remained at the estate, managing the heavy parchment ledgers and reviewing every new contract sealed with wax. The village gossip did not spare them. Word spread that the new mistress of the guild was a low-born maid. There were whispers in the muddy market squares and sneers from the wives of wealthy landowners, but Bess paid them no mind. She had weathered far worse storms than the idle chatter of idle people. The following spring, when the snows melted, the two were married again in the cold stone church. This time, there were no lies, no disguises, and no fear. The congregation was small, but it was filled with genuine warmth. Arthur stood tall and proud at the altar, leaning on no one, while Bess wore a beautiful bridal wreath of spring flowers upon her head. When their eyes met as they spoke their vows, no grand words were needed. Everything they had survived together was reflected in that single, steady gaze. Years passed, and the guild not only reclaimed the glory it held during Edmund's time, but surpassed it, becoming the wealthiest and most respected trading house in the Shires. Everyone knew that Bess, the mistress of the house, had once been a peasant maid. But as time wore on, the mocking whispers were replaced by a legend. The villagers spoke of the heir who feigned deafness and the brave maid who took another's place at the altar. They told the tale of how the two outcasts had joined forces, unearthed a terrible murder, and reclaimed their stolen birthright. It became a beloved story of two souls who, knowing each other's deepest secrets, chose to fight the darkness together. Arthur and Bess lived a long and prosperous life together, their bond unbreakable. And their story echoed through the taverns and hearths of the medieval village for generations to come.